All right, good afternoon. All right, I did skip the video last week, so I'm going to talk a little bit about last week's reading, which is really about plantation prisons. And it wasn't a really long article, and it was mostly pictures, so I hope you kind of enjoyed a break from all the reading. And last week's reading is related to this reading, right? So all of this really covers race and crime and perceptions of race and crime and stereotypes and prejudice and racial bias in the criminal justice system. And so where to start? I'm going to bring up some of my notes so I don't skip over anything. But I guess let me talk a little bit about how I have come to see the influence of race upon crime and reactions to crime and punishment, I guess throughout my career, right? I guess I was probably like a lot of people raised in the South. Of course, I'm white, and I, like most people, carried a number of stereotypes, racial biases. That should be of no surprise that that happens to someone who is born in the South, right? I don't know, not really my fault or anything like that, but it is a problem because it prevents me from understanding the way that society, crime, reactions to crime truly are, right? If I have these biases, right? And so I started taking classes in criminology and in sociology. And for me, as someone that looks like me and has had the background that I had, I found it kind of curious that like race just kept coming up, right? But, and you might feel like this, right? Why is he talking so much about race in this class? About crime? And it is, but the effect of race and our perceptions of race and how we define crime, how we look for crime, what neighborhoods we look for crime, who we think and expect to be a criminal and not be a criminal. All of those things, how severe we sanction some criminals versus others. The way that decisions are made in the criminal justice system, in the correction systems, all of these things are influenced by race. Now, they're not the only thing, right? And we've spent an entire semester talking about all sorts of other explanations, right? But it is an important part of the picture, right? And and that's why we're going to talk about it, right? And if you take another class of mine about prisons and mass incarceration, which I'll be teaching over the summer, right? You'll probably learn this lesson, right? You might have already learned this lesson that we didn't always have prisons in the United States. We really didn't always have prisons anywhere in the world. And prisons are a relatively recent invention, right? And typically the way that the story is told in textbooks is that our first prison was in, it's called Eastern State Penitentiary, and it was outside of Philadelphia, although now you'd probably say it's smack dab in the middle of Philadelphia, right? And that institution was modeled heavily off of religious institutions, right? So when prisoners came there, they would do penitence. That's why it's called, religious penitent. They would atone for their sins, right? That's a religious concept. That's why it's called a penitentiary, because you would, and just like monks, you would take a vow of silence, right? You couldn't speak. You'd be given one book, and that would be a Bible, and you were supposed to read and pray, and it was supposed to reform your wayward soul, so to speak, right? And save the prisoner from his own sin, from harming other people. And the idea was that at the end of it, he would be transformed, right, by this religious experience, right? And and people, they didn't talk to each other. They lived solitary lives, like very much like a monk, right? And the Quaker denomination of Christianity, because Pennsylvania was founded by Quakers, right? And they had a big influence upon this, right? And now these, right? Now, that's all of everything that I told you is true. But that's not how prisons in the South worked, right? As a lot of things are, they're totally different in the South, right? And so prisons in the South emerged and modeled themselves after totally different institutions, right? And that's why I assigned you the reading, and I wanted you to look at all those pictures, right, of plantain. Sorry, I've been misspeaking all day. Plantation prisons, right? The name tells you, right? Our first prisons in the South were modeled off of slavery as it existed on plantations, right? They worked exactly like it. In fact, they happened on the exact same geographical location as the plantation, right? So explain how this kind of happens. All right. We really did not have any prisons at all until after slavery, right? And it was some time after slavery, right? And slavery itself is a system of social control that controls black bodies, forces them to do labor, right? Forces them to live certain places and do certain things. And it's a very exploitive system of social control, right? Where the benefits of their labor go to plantation owners, right? Well, the Civil War, in some ways, changed some of that. In other ways, it didn't change much at all, right? So, Civil War happened, and black African Americans were no longer under this old system of slavery, of chattel slavery, right? But there was still a need for labor. The very elite landowners, the aristocrats, still needed cheap labor, and they were quite used to it. They were dependent upon that cheap labor, right? So they developed a new system that would provide cheap labor, right? And so what happened is they passed a number of laws that criminalized all sorts of behavior that was relatively common, right? They criminalized vagrancy, loitering. You had to be employed at all given times and carry a contract that said that you were employed. And if you weren't, you had to have money on you. And if you weren't, you could be subject to being arrested. Also, people were arrested that didn't even commit crimes. People just said that they did, right? And after they were arrested, they became convicts, right? And if you look at the wording of the 14th Amendment, in slavery, except for those who are being punished for violation of the law, right? And what it did is it took the exact same black laborers, the exact same black bodies, right, that had been working as slaves, often in the exact same fields, picking many of the same crops, right? And it returned them to those fields and forced them to work, right? And to do the same labor. And the benefits of that labor would go to plantation owners. And the plantation, rather than owning those, the state was in control of that labor, and they would lease it. That's what we call convict leasing, right? And that system went on for quite a while, kind of until early 1900s. And one of the problems with that, there's many problems with that, right? System, but it was rife with corruption, right? Because those who controlled the labor of these convicts, they would bargain with plantation owners, rich landowners, right? And, give some of their friends, maybe their family as well, good deals, right? And they could be bribed, right? And so it was a system that over time people saw how corrupt it was. So they slightly changed the model, right? And here's what they did, right? After slavery, a lot of white landowners lost their plantations, right? I mean, there were years after the Civil War where before the convict leasing system really emerged and had enough laborers in it, a lot of plantations would have crops in the field, and they would simply rot in the field, right? And that would force people to lose their land, right? And so, what would happen is if you don't pay your taxes on your land, the state will put a lien on them and will take them. The state bought up large amounts of land, and rather than leasing out the convicts, they would create a prison, right? And Holman was created like this. Parchman Prison was created. Pretty much all of those prisons that you saw in the photo essay, right? And what would happen is people would come to the prison, and they would, be held there at night, but during the day they'd work out in the fields, right? And they would provide enough food to feed all the prisoners and all the workers there, but they would also provide a surplus and sell it, right? And so the state of Alabama, really all southern states, all the states that used to own slaves, would use the labor of convicts and make lots of money, right? And prisons would pay for themselves and provide a lot of money, right? And that's, kind of the way that it worked all the way up into the 50s and 60s pretty much, right? I see even remnants of that and later than that, right? But eventually, that system started to change, and slowly prisons began to appear something a little bit more like they are now. Although, right? If you look at Alabama prisons, particularly at work release programs, which include a large number of prisoners in Alabama, they don't typically go out and work in fields any longer, right? But they work at places like Burger King and restaurants, and they're dishwashers and cooks, and sometimes they work on the side of the road picking up trash and stuff like that. And, a lot of people are of the opinion that, oh, that's great, they should have a job and stuff like that. But there's some problems, right? And a lot of these have come to light recently in the state of Alabama, right? We've had a problem with parole where we don't parole very many people at all in the state of Alabama Department of Corrections, even though prisons are way overcrowded, and parole is one way of reducing overcrowded prisons, right? So this kind of came to light a year or two ago, right? And some of these prisoners have served the majority of their sentence, and they come before the parole board. And often the parole board would say, they're a risk to public safety, so they won't release them, right? Because they're afraid that they'll commit some crime once released, right? And they'll victimize some citizen out in the free world, right? And that makes sense. Except many of those people that they say they denied parole because they're too big of a risk to public safety, many of those people are out in our communities every day. They're working in restaurants. They're working on the side of the road. They're fixing our sandwiches and our cheeseburgers and stuff. So it's kind of hard to see how these people are such a big risk, but we let them out every day of the week, right? And we garnish their wages, right? So they only get a very small percentage of their pay. The state of Alabama gets the rest of it, right? And, maybe the state of Alabama should get some, maybe they should deny some people parole. But it's hard for me to understand that they're safe enough to go work and be exploited, and but they're not safe enough to put on parole, right? It looks like the decisions about parole are being made not based upon public safety and risk to public safety, but instead they're being based upon economics, right? The state of Alabama needs this money. They need to exploit this labor, right? And I think that's a big ethical problem, I think, that we have, right? And so in some ways, this convict lease system continues, right? And corporations are the real winners in this, right? Just like convict leasing and plantation, they're the winners in this. And it produces all these perverse incentives to round up more and more people, right? And exploit their labor, right? And it also serves as a system of racial control, right? It controls some groups, subordinate racial groups, and subordinate ethnic groups, Hispanics, and disproportionately, right? If you go to prison in Alabama and you look around, the thing that is most apparent, undeniable, is that most of the people in there are African American or black. Now I'm recording a video, okay? You need me to sign something? Where?
Right there, just put it on the book.
There you go. Thanks, sweetie.
Goodbye.
All right. My daughter's very serious about her reading homework, right? Aren't you serious about it?
Yeah.
Yeah, you come home every day and you do your reading, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's a very good student, a much better student than I was at her age, right? So when I would get home when I was 10 years old, I'd go play. I wouldn't want to do my homework. She goes straight to her room and does her homework, and she has a timer and supposed to read a certain amount, and then I have to sign that off. And I don't really need to monitor her or anything. She's such a sweet girl. She always does what she's supposed to do, at least up to this point in her life, right? All right, so sorry about that interruption, but that's my daughter, and it's very important to her that she complete that task. Oh, so I was talking about, I was talking about, so in the absence of slavery, we develop these other systems of social control. And they're largely geared at controlling the behavior of poor and racial and ethnic minorities, right? Yeah, right? And, when we pass laws, we often criminalize the behavior that we think is typical of minorities. And we punish that behavior more severely when we look for acts of violation of the law. Typically, we go to poor minority neighborhoods, whether they're racial or ethnic. That's where we send the police officers, and that's where you look. That's where you'll find crime, right? And when we find crime, we tend to throw the book at some people more than others, right? And those people get longer sentences, they're more likely to get convicted. Even if you look at a number of people that are convicted for the exact same crime, like, I don't know, possession of small amount of cocaine or something like that. Typically, the minorities get much longer sentences, even when it's the exact same charge, right? And same amount of that substance, right? And then they often have different experiences in corrections, right? Because that's the institution that continues to be segregated, right? And then they have different experiences at parole. White convicts much more likely to get paroled earlier, even if you control for previous criminal experiences or charges in the past or conviction. Once they're on probation or parole, they're more likely. Certain ethnic blacks and Hispanics, racial and ethnic minorities are more likely to have the terms of their probation or parole violated, more so than whites, right? So as we try to explain the way that the criminal justice system works, you can't really explain it without some reference to race, right? Where did our prisons come from? What they model themselves after? How does our criminal system act, and how does it make decisions and stuff? Now, there are other factors that enter into that, but certainly race plays a large role, right? And I'm going to kind of shift and talk about punitiveness, right? This is actually, I don't know, I've become increasingly interested in punitiveness. And punitiveness is an attitude, right? And so the way that it's typically measured is, oh boy, I had all this stuff brought up. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, all right, I'm doing better. So if you look at this reading, and really all you need to do is look at the executive summary, the kind of summary of race and punishment, racial perceptions of crime and support for punitive, right? This is written by a name Gandouche, I believe is how that's pronounced, Nazgul Gandouche. But this is a report from the Sentencing Project, right? And what it's looking at is kind of stereotypes, prejudice, racial bias, right? And punitive attitudes, right? Now, you've probably noticed throughout your life that, like, some people are very punitive and other people are more lenient, right? You know, if you ask people what should we do about crime, some people are like, you know, lock them up, throw away the key, execute them, torture them, just, you know, really barbaric, punitive approach. And other people are like, rehabilitate them, you know, bind them, feed them, and stuff like that. So, and then most people are kind of in the middle of those two extremes, right? That's punitiveness. That you know, some people are like, you know, really tough on crime, and other people are less like that, right? One of the strongest predictors of how punitive you are is your race. White people are much more punitive than black people, right? Yeah. Men, much more punitive than women. Rich people, more punitive than poor people, right? Those are all the kind of correlates of punitive attitudes, right? And the way that you measure that is you ask people for their preferences about a number of policy. So, you know, typically you'll ask like 6 questions, right? And there'll be things like, do you think juveniles should be tried as adults, right? Juvenile waivers, right? Another one is, do you support the death penalty? If you do, you're more punitive, right? Do you support 3 strikes and you're out? So if you commit 3 felonies, then you get life in prison, right? Do you support truth in sentencing, which is if you're sentenced to 10 years, then that means you're going to serve out 85% of that sentence before you're available for parole, right? Truth in sentencing typically means given 10 years, you're going to serve at least 8.5 years, or 85%, right? And so you take all of those different surveys, and there's different ways of doing this. You can kind of average them or something like that, and that's how you calculate a measure of punitiveness, right? And it is true, like I said earlier, white people are much more punitive. And that's kind of remarkable because white people are less likely to be victims of crime than black people, right? And, you might think that whoever gets victimized the most, they would be punitive, but no, right? And some other things like kind of these perceptions, stereotypes about race is if you ask white people in surveys, right, just randomly selected people in a survey, how much crime is committed by black people, they overestimate that, right? So they have the stereotypes that black people are more criminal than they actually are, right? We have in our society, and to some extent this is true among black people and white people, that they both have stereotypes as blacks being more likely to be criminal, right? And it's not just whites that have these stereotypes, but it's both, right? But whites do overestimate, and for example, in a 2010 survey, right, asked people to estimate the actual share of burglaries, illegal drug sales, and juvenile crime committed by African Americans. They overestimate it by 20 to 30%. White people do, right? The truth is, when you look at arrest rates, that's actually 20-30% lower than what they say, right? So that's the stereotype about blacks and that they're more criminal, right? And it's one that's not based solely in reality. They overestimate that, right? And those people that more strongly associate crime with minorities that have the stereotype about blacks, those people are much more likely to be punitive, right? They're the people, right? And I don't know, that if you know people in the South, like you probably know those people that have racial stereotypes, they're often the same people that are like, lock them up, throw away the key, really tough on crime. So that tracks, as the kids say, right? So where do these perceptions come from? We talked about this, I think, earlier in this class. Is like, we often think that like there's a lot more crime than there is. A lot of us think that minorities are much more prone to committing crime. And, a good bit of this comes from media. Average citizens don't sit around and look at arrest statistics from the FBI, right? But they do watch the nightly news, particularly the local news. And if you watch the local news, the way that they report, like typically when they report crime, it's crime on the poor side of town, on the minority, where most minorities are. It's a high number of minorities in that side of town. Certainly Birmingham news is like that, Mobile news, Atlanta, every southern city. So it gives you this skewed perception, right? Now, there's crime committed by white people in the white parts of town, by richer people and stuff like that. But they just less likely to report on it, and yeah, just less likely to report on it. It doesn't, I don't know, fit the crime story narrative or whatever. Yeah. And this presents a real problem, right? Politicians often, not always, but oftentimes they're like, the reason why we pass all of these get tough on crime laws, like 3 strikes you're out, death penalty, and they'll tell you, like, the reason why I do this is because it's popular, right? This is what people that vote for me tell me that they want, right? They want me to be harsh on crime, right? They want me to lock up the criminals and lock them up for longer periods of time and make the prison conditions worse and stuff, right? But a lot of this sentiment, this get tough on crime approach, is not based upon a careful examination of the statistics, but instead is based on stereotypes, right? Not grounded in reality, right? And that is kind of the crux of the matter, right? Politicians should reflect the sentiments of their citizens. They're our representatives, right? But what if those sentiments are based in racial stereotypes, racial prejudice, racial animus, right? I don't believe they should then, right? Because what we have is, the whole idea of democracy is that these people will represent our interests, right? But there's other important aspects of democracy in America, right? That you won't do things that are unconstitutional, right? That you won't judge some people more harshly just because of their race, right? And so I think that our politicians, sure, they should be receptive, but when it's based in stereotypes and prejudice and racial animus and stuff like that, I think they have a leadership responsibility that, they should, that should temper the sentiments of their constituents if they're based in racism, right? My opinion, right? It's kind of interesting, like, I don't know, lots of things about this are interesting to me. The system that is full of, the criminal justice system is full of racial bias. Not full of it, but there's plenty of evidence. Everywhere we look, we find racial bias in our criminal justice, every decision-making step of the system, right? But in a kind of curious way, it provides evidence that supports and justifies, right? Because a lot of people would go to a prison, see large numbers of minorities, and they would, this is evidence that they're more criminal than white people. I don't think that's the lesson, right? That you should see who's in a prison and say, there's something, deeper going on with race. But in a lot of ways, the system provides its own justification, if that makes sense to you, right? And a lot of these ideas, earlier I kind of told you about my own experience, and anyone that grows up in the South is going to be socialized into the system and have, be taught a number of attitudes and prejudice and stereotypes, and no one's immune to that, right? White and black people, right, are not immune to that. And anyone that we draw out, police officers, they are drawn out of larger society, and they're not immune to that either, right? And over the last 10 years and stuff, we've had a lot of controversy with like police interactions with minorities, right? And I know a lot of people are really tough upon police officers and accuse them of all sorts of stuff, but racism, of course, and violence and stuff like that. They have a difficult job, a dangerous job, and those people are drawn out of society, and they're subject to the exact same socialization experiences. Now, they need to be, all of us probably need to be educated. I certainly need to be educated, and I've learned a lot about, I no longer hold those kind of naive ideas about race that I grew up with, right? And I think I was, certainly a lot of people that I grew up with had much harsher ideas about race than I did, but we all have racial biases, right? All of us do. And once we can admit that, right, then we can examine them, and then occasionally we can account for them, right? And even correct and rectify them. But if we walk around saying, I don't have any racial bias, right? Nah, not me, right? Then we can't examine that. We can't correct for it. We can't acknowledge it. We can't do anything about it. We can't improve it, right? So that's kind of my stand about, racial stereotypes and biases and stuff like that, right? Yeah. So let me try to take a step back, right? And think of what I've tried to communicate, right? We've talked a little bit about prisons, and of course I've talked about punitive attitudes and stuff like that. And one of the things that's really unique about the United States compared to other countries like Western European countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, right, is that we have a lot of crime relative to other countries, right? And we also incarcerate an unbelievable number of people relative to those other countries, right? Makes us really unique in a lot of ways, right? And we have embarked on this large-scale experiment of mass incarceration, where since the late 60s, we have increasingly put more funding, more police officers, more surveillance, more prisons, held more people in those prisons, right? And that has become our way of exerting social control upon society, right? And we have gone on a whole hog end, so to speak, right? Like no other society that exists. We spend a huge amount of our budget on this, right? And I think every once in a while we need to step back and, we did all this things thinking that we would reduce crime, but has it, right? We continue to have, I'm kind of the opinion that this big experimental, this kind of get tough on crime approach, and then when it didn't reduce crime, we just kind of doubled down on it, give them longer sentences, right? And when that didn't reduce crime, just double down on that, right? At some point, I think we need to take a step back and say, maybe a lot of the stuff that we're doing doesn't reduce crime. Maybe it increases crime, right? And I know that we intend to reduce crime, but there's other ways that we could respond to crime. And some other countries do respond to crime in other ways. It's not this kind of get tough, always prison, always real punitive, focused upon retribution. Some, in order to reduce crime, treat people. They rehabilitate people. They find out what's wrong with them that causes them to commit crime, and they try to correct those things, right? Here in the state of Alabama, we're not doing much of that. We're not really rehabilitating people. We're not taking people that have problems, fixing those problems, and re-releasing them. Instead, what's happening in the state of Alabama is we're taking people that have problems, we're making those problems worse by traumatizing them, right? And allowing them to victimize each other and allow correctional staff to victimize them. People go to prison, they find out there's more drugs in prisons than there ever was in the neighborhood they lived in, right? And now, prison's a place where drugs offer an escape, right? So people don't get sober when they go to prison. They don't stop using drugs. They use more, right? And when they get to the end of their sentence, they're not rehabilitated drug offender. They're one with more problems of addiction. And then we release them back into society. And also, in the state of Alabama, the way that our prisons are, I don't know if you've watched some of these recent documentaries like An Alabama Solution or read any Department of Justice investigative reports, but our prisons are not sites for rehabilitation. They're sites for mass trauma, right? Everyone that goes to prisons, and it's mostly black males that go to prison in the state of Alabama, they get out more traumatized than when they got in there, right? And that does not reduce crime, right? It punishes people, yeah, but it does not reduce crime, right? So I think every once in a while, maybe we're at one of these moments in society where we're like, maybe what we've been doing doesn't work, right? The analogy that I always compare it to is like, you probably grew up with people, like I certainly grew up, and I think this is common in the South. You grew up with some people and their parents are incredibly punitive. Like, I had friends, their parents would beat the hell out of them, right? And I suppose they meant well, right? Like they thought if they did that, the child would behave and stop doing all the bad things that they were doing, right? But when the kid continues to do the same behavior, a lot of the parents would just beat them twice as long or twice as hard, right? At some point, the parent has to say, maybe beating them, maybe being so punitive to them is not helping them, but it's harming them. And that's why it's not correcting the behavior, right? But a lot of dumbass parents would just keep beating them harder and longer, and different objects that will inflict more pain and stuff like that. And I kind of think that's where we are as a state, is that what we've been doing hadn't been working. Hadn't been working for 40 years, right? Most of my life. But a lot of people are just saying, be more mean to them. Lock them up even longer. Make the conditions of prison even worse. And then they won't only go back to prison, right? It's not working. We need a whole new approach to this, right? And I think a lot of that, a lot of that cruelty is based in the, race relations and these ideas that some people are less human than other people, and maybe they don't experience as much pain, you know, we have to treat them in a certain way that's different than people in our own racial group and stuff like that. See, all those ideas emerged hundreds of years ago, and they're still with us, right? They're still very much with us, right? All right, I'm going to stop talking about punitiveness and race and all this stuff. But you know, these are the things that I've learned over the last 30 years of studying the American criminal justice system. And I just really don't think you can explain how the system works, what we want out of it, what we expect out of it, who benefits from the system, who's more harmed from this benefit. I don't think you can explain all these things adequately without some reference to race. And to be quite honest, like the older I get and maybe the more knowledgeable I get, I see like, oh boy, race plays a greater and greater. I recognize, acknowledge that race plays a much greater role in this, you know. A lot of people, if you ask them to imagine what a criminal looks like, close their eyes, and you ask them and they'll be honest with you, right? They probably imagine a young black male, right? As kind of the typical criminal. Yeah. I'm not sure everyone would be honest with you if you ask them that. But there are these stereotypes tied up with race and crime. They've been with us hundreds of years, right? And they're pervasive, and they're deeply ingrained in our society. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this. If you think that I'm totally wrong and I have no idea what I'm talking about, that's okay too, I suppose, right? But at least consider the possibility, right? Y'all have a nice day, and I'll get a quiz up about all this in a second.